Hey everybody, Casey here with Life Abstract Gaming, and this week I want to talk about a recently released title that's one of the latest examples of the ways video games can relay experiences that no other medium can. Let's discuss Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice.
He's so far away. They've taken his soul. To these gods you cannot pray. They can break you, but not your promise. Even death won't keep you apart. Through his darkness you will find him. In your sword still beats our heart. You fought for love unspoiled by your darkness within. You fought for your dreams. Now there's no way to win. In the head of his corpse lies the seat of his soul. So you must carry his vessel to bring him back home.
Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice is the latest work from the English developer Ninja Theory. Their biggest titles of the past were Heavenly Sword, Enslaved: Odyssey to the West, and the Devil May Cry reboot DMC, which is actually one of my favorite games I've ever played. It was off of the strength of DMC and its amazing combat mechanics that I was so interested in Hellblade, but it's a distinctly different experience. The basis of the game is that you play as a female Celtic warrior named Senua, who's on a journey through the Norse mythological equivalent of Hell. However, Senua suffers from psychosis, which her culture refers to as the darkness, so you can never be quite sure if the events unfolding are actually happening as presented. Senua carries with her the decapitated head of her murdered lover Dillion, as she believes she needs it to bring his soul back from the Norse underworld he was sacrificed to when their home was raided. The game tells us before it ever starts to use headphones for the optimal experience, which I strongly suggest you follow, as Ninja Theory utilized 3D sound capture tech to simulate the voices Senua hears in her head. Hearing voices is one of the most well-known symptoms of psychosis, and they are used throughout the entire game to great effect. These voices even act as a HUD for players, as the game actually doesn't have one. They can distract you and confuse you, but oftentimes they will give you hints and information you desperately need, especially in combat. A deep combat system is what I was looking for from Ninja Theory, and at first glance, Hellblade seems a bit simple, but what I confused for simple was actually just intuitive. The combat is fairly straightforward, but grows in depth as the voices hint at what Senua can and should do mid-fight. After engaging an enemy with light and heavy attacks, you'll hear the voices tell Senua to focus, which you could interpret as basic advice, but if you actually listen and press the right trigger, which normally zooms in on objects, Senua can enter a slowed down state where enemies reel back and can be struck many more times. If Senua gets surrounded, the voices will warn her of that, and yell "look out" as enemies try to attack from behind. It took some getting used to, but I found the voice warnings to be just as effective as on-screen prompts. Timing blocks just right will counter enemy attacks, which is a skill you'll need to get used to when the game starts throwing tougher enemies in larger numbers. After your first death though, the game warns you that if you die too much, you'll lose your save progress, indicated by how close a dark infection growing on Senua's arm is to reaching her head, which is a legitimate worry since the combat does get tough, especially when dealing with some of the bosses. I do want to call attention to one boss fight in particular. This may be a minor spoiler, but the last third of that fight takes place in a near pitch black environment where you can only use the sound of the boss's attacks to time your dodges and attack his position. It was one of the most memorable moments of the game for me, as I realized that the fight up until that point was slowly training me to be able to do this. Combat, however, doesn't make up the bulk of Hellblade. There's actually a lot more exploration of the environments and lengthy stretches of environmental and perspective puzzle solving. What I mean by this is Senua will oftentimes come across gates with symbols or runes etched into them. In order to open the gates, she'll need to look around the area and find those symbols as they naturally exist in the environment. They can literally be just about anything, from wooden beams and shadows on walls to stains on the ground and reflections on water. The perspective puzzles go even further, where in some instances, Senua can reconstruct broken pieces of the environment from looking at it from the correct angle, as shattered glass-like pieces of the full picture float about in the air. The other kinds of puzzles consist of navigating what amounts to big environmental mazes to get to points of interest or to just get to the right location to solve another perspective puzzle. While I did find a lot of these instances interesting, especially a section where looking through certain gates at the right angle will show you a slightly different version of the world, oftentimes they could grind your progress through the game to a halt. I spent far more time than I would have liked walking in circles around the area trying to find the one correct spot I needed to be in. In these instances, the lack of variety in non-combat gameplay becomes apparent, but once you do figure it out, you don't feel so much like your brain was teased as much as you feel annoyed for not realizing it sooner. Ninja Theory provided a 20 to 30 minute documentary about the creative process concerning Hellblade that's accessible from the main menu. In it, they detail how substantially they researched mental illness, going so far as to hire doctors as mental health consultants and holding group sessions with people who have dealt with mental illness themselves. Several aspects of various kinds of psychoses were represented in-game, from the voices they hear to the way light reflects and blurs to shifting walls and haunting delusions. The thread about deleting your save file is also a way to enforce paranoia and anxiety, and even the puzzle gameplay is a way to illustrate how some people with psychoses will draw connections and meaning between seemingly unconnected things in their world and their lives. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice is a game that I personally think a lot of people should have on their must playlist, as it's an example of how video games can affect us and allow us to empathize with our peers in a way that's never been done before. So, what are your thoughts on Hellblade and its depiction of mental illness? How do you feel about games looking at these kinds of topics? Let us know. We're listening.